Okay, third time's the charm. Welcome. I'm Michaela Bucchianeri. I am a licensed psychologist and a copy coach for health and wellness professionals. If you've been with me here on my platform this week, we are celebrating all week long. We're celebrating my transition to full-time copy coach for health and wellness professionals. And if you are here from the Holding Space for Therapists audience, warm welcome to you. I'm so glad to have been invited back onto Cassidy's podcast. I had a great experience a couple of years ago now when I was first on the podcast talking about copywriting. So a little bit of context for this. Here, I'll put up our little slide. A little bit of context for this live series after the episode. I started doing these for a couple of reasons. First, it gives me a chance to answer if questions come through about the episode itself. In this case, the episode just went live yesterday, so there might not be too many questions yet, but it gives me a chance to answer any questions that you have about the content itself. But then at kind of a more meta level, it gives me a chance to share a little behind the scenes of the experience of being a guest on various podcasts and to share any little tips or reflections that I think might be helpful to you. So that's the spirit of this. That's the purpose of it. And I'll share more about this at the end, but I do have a couple of resources to support you in this. Hi, welcome. If you are interested in pitching yourself as a podcast guest. So the first is a free training that will set you up for some of the prep work that Cassidy and I talked about in this episode. And then I also have a course that can support you in all of the stages of pitching yourself as a podcast guest, from the first kind of brainstorming and strategizing to researching podcasts to pitch, your right fit podcast to pitch, to actually crafting the pitches, doing the interview, and then very importantly, promoting that piece of content you've co-created so that it works for you and supports your goals in your business. We never just want to get our names out there. We always want to have some kind of a specific goal or strategy in mind. So that's what I'm here to share. I like to do just keep these pretty brief. And so I've chosen one question that came through. I thought it was a great one. This was from a grad student who is still working on their training. And they asked, should you wait until you have a paid offer, like a paid service or product or something, before you start pitching yourself as a podcast guest? And I said, no, I don't think you need to wait. And I also think it's worth being very strategic in how you use podcast appearances, even at that earlier stage. So what I mean by that is there's no sense wasting the opportunity to start building your own community, right? So for example, if you know, well, in the case of the person who asked this question, they're training to become a therapist. And so they're wondering, well, if I'm still accruing my hours, I'm still training, does it make sense for me to try and get in front of audiences that maybe are looking for a therapist right away? And what I encouraged her to think about was, as best you can, try and project into the future. Who do you most want to work with? And that might change, of course, but right now, who do you think you want to be working with? What kinds of topics do you want to focus on? And then work backwards to reverse engineer something free that you could offer in exchange for contact information, in exchange for the email addresses of listeners to that podcast. That's how you start using podcast appearances to gradually build your own community, so that when the time comes and you are ready to offer something, whether that's individual therapy, whether that's some kind of an online workshop or resource, then you already have people there who you know are interested in what you have to share. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have follow-up questions about that. Let's see. So I see a question here. Is it true that you need to build an audience and trust before offering a product? I mean, the catch-all answer is it depends, but yes, I think you do, just because it's going to give you the best shot at actually selling that product. So just be thinking about again, like that doesn't just go for trainees. Even if you're already in business, be thinking about how can I be as strategic as possible in building an audience. When we start doing podcast outreach, I mean, it is a long game. It's content marketing, which means while podcast audiences tend to be very invested and engaged audience members, it's not a very quick turnover. Oftentimes, the podcast episode is the first step toward the relationship building that might ultimately result in them working with you. So think about it that way, think long term, and try to think strategically. But again, the resources that I'll link to in the notes here should help you get started. So I jotted down a couple of behind the scenes things that I think will be helpful from this interview experience. And some lessons that you can kind of take away from it. So the first one has to do with the fact that this was kind of a hybrid pitch invitation situation. I always like to be transparent on here about whether these episodes I've been a part of were invited or whether I pitched the host. And in this case, it was a topic that I planned to pitch Cassidy on, but hadn't gotten around to it. And then she heard me talking about it in my stories, and we were just kind of DMing back and forth. And out of that came this conversation that resulted in us planning the episode together. So it was kind of a hybrid situation. But one lesson to take from that is if you already have a contact, like if you already have a relationship with someone, I still think it's a good idea to craft a formal pitch. So I did follow up with an email outlining, like, here's my proposal of what we talk about and some bullet points, because I just think that shows respect for the host. And it also can be helpful then in forming a loose outline for your conversation. The next thing I jotted down is notes. So I wrote down some bulleted notes. My approach is to prepare, but prepare judiciously. We're not scripting out every word you're going to say on the episode because, first of all, I think that will actually create more stress than alleviate it. But also, you won't end up sticking to that script because it's a real live conversation. There's another human being that's going to be steering the conversation in different ways. And so I do think it's a good idea, though, to share, to jot down some bullet points, just some key points that you want to make sure that you make, especially if the focus of that topic is more educational in nature. In this case, it was. I also find it helpful, and this, you know yourself best, but because Cassidy is a friend of mine, I could very easily see myself just kind of veering off into chit-chat mode, which would be fun for us, but maybe not as useful to her audience. So some notes are really helpful. One little tech thing. I can't think of a time that I've done one of these and I haven't shared about a tech thing that's happened. But in this case, Cassidy was in a different space. We had some stuff going on in our environment here. Anyway, there ended up being a delay in the recording. Cassidy's a total pro, so she acknowledged it. She was able to do some magic on the editing end so that it wasn't as obvious in the final episode. But that's the kind of thing, what I want to encourage you is don't let yourself be distracted or unnerved by it. Tech things will happen. Just know that you can always pause and just say to the host, I'm noticing a little delay. Are you hearing that as well? That's the kind of thing that can be edited out in their post-production afterwards. And you never go wrong by communicating. So you can even do that in the moment communication with the host. Much better to do that so that then you can kind of troubleshoot or make a plan going forward rather than having that weighing on your mind during the interview, because that could be distracting. What else? Oh, we recorded video as well as audio, and that was because Cassidy's been experimenting with using video clips to help promote the episode. More and more hosts are doing this that I'm noticing, and I think many of them will give you the option. So Cassidy did. She said, would you be up for doing video? I think if you can do it, do it. It's good experience. It actually kind of prompts you to be a little more organized when you sit down, because you're not going to be, reading straight off your notes. It helps you stay more engaged in the conversation maybe, but also it's just a cool experience. And then that's it's like another dimension of your co-created content that can be repurposed and reshared. I'll talk about that in a minute. the promotion piece, Cassidy did some really cool things that helped it make it even more easy for us to wring every last drop of goodness from our episode. That's something I talk about a lot in my course, and it's something I talk about all the time here, which is that, hey, welcome. We have Cassidy, our host here. So when we talk about co-created content, I see it as both a responsibility and a benefit that you share, right? So what we don't want to do is bop in for the interview and then jet on out of there and let the host and the host's support team, if there is one, do all the heavy lifting. We really want to own our role as a co-creator of that content. So in this case, that means I'm doing things like this afterwards. I'm sharing about it in real time this week, but I'll be repurposing and resharing pieces about it in the future with my email list as part of a content roundup. I'll be sharing quotes or sound bites from our episode in my own content in the coming weeks. It's a way to keep the party going, but also to communicate to the host, hey, I'm in this with you. We created this thing together, and I'm going to help make sure that it just explodes out in front of as many people as possible. And so what was really fun is that in this case, the timing happened to work out so that it aligned with, yep, Cassidy says, keep the party going. Exactly. It just happened to work out with some other fun things Cassidy was planning in relation to the relaunch of her course for therapists. Next week, Cassidy, is that right? Hi, welcome, Libby. So what that meant was that I got to be part of a day in the life feature, which you can check out over on Cassidy's account. I'll link it and everything in the IGTV afterwards, but I got to be kind of a featured day in the life person. And I also have been sharing about it just as part of my party week here. These are all kind of just unique pieces that really help expand it from one standalone episode that you may or may not catch, even if you're a loyal audience member of a podcast, but that you are very likely to get wind of if it's just kind of echoed out across all these different surfaces. And one thing to remember, if it ever starts to feel like, oh, is this overkill? Am I talking about it too much? No, people need lots of opportunities to connect with content that you're creating. So, okay, Cassidy says, yes, next week her course will be reopened. So I'll make sure that you've got all the info linked here afterwards. But this experience, and especially the promotion of this co-created episode, is such a great example of it in my mind that I'm going to go back and actually add some examples from this episode with Cassidy to my course as an illustration of that shared responsibility of promoting podcast episodes. So that is a really big piece of the course, is everything that happens after the interview, because we don't often hear about that, but that's a big part of it. People tend to think about the pitch and the actual interview when really I think it's the beginning and the end that are even juicier. All the thoughtful preparation and then everything you do as a team afterwards to make sure it reaches people. Let's see. Cassidy wants to hop in live. Heck yes, you can. Let me add you. What a treat. All right, Cassidy's not letting me add you. There we go. Here she comes, everyone. Hey!
I mean, I just got finished pumping and I saw that you went live and I was like, my next appointment's not for 30 minutes. Like, why don't I tune in? And then
why not?
I wanted a chance to chat with you again.
Just add one more thing here to your plate. Thank you so much for being here. What a treat. So yes, this is our host. This is our lovely host, Dr. Cassidy Freitas, if you don't already know.
How fun. Well, I will say that I hadn't really thought of this in the phrasing of co-creating something together. And I mean, of course, you, the queen of copy, like language into my lingo. And I love that. I love the idea that, like, yes, when you are recording a podcast together, when you go live with each other, when you are collaborating on anything, you're co-creating, and there's an opportunity there for both of you to not only get in front of a new audience and hopefully start to build those intentional bridges between, you know, whoever is in that audience and what it is that you have to offer, but you get a chance to connect with somebody, to not have to do it all on your own, right? Like, you've been sharing such amazing stories about the things that we're doing, and I can reshare those, and it's creating more content for me to share with my audience and giving them more value. And so it's just such a beautiful way, I think, to nurture your audience, and to not be doing it alone, and to develop also, like, for instance, the word co-creation. I had never really phrased it as that way before, but now I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to tell people I learned it from you, and that gives more and more reason for people to learn about you and the work that you're doing. So all good stuff.
I love that. Thank you so much. And, you know, sometimes we say things and then we forget that was ever a thing we didn't say. And I didn't used to talk about it as co-created content, but it totally is in my mind. And I just like that because it keeps it front and center that this is a shared responsibility. This is like your co-creators, your co-pals in this endeavor. And one thing I want to say, just as an encouragement to folks, I hear from people that are kind of earlier in their podcast outreach, and maybe they've gotten some no's or not yet, or it's not, the timing's not quite right. Just piggybacking on what Cassidy just said so beautifully, I want to encourage you that even if a podcast episode is not something that you're going to co-create, don't discount the possibility that there could be other things you could collaborate on. There could be something like a joint live. Maybe that fits more in the schedule of the person you've reached out to. You never quite know. And so viewing podcast outreach as not this like golden ring we're grasping for and maybe we get lucky. Think of it as an opportunity to do some of that relationship building. I think that helps bring the stress level down. It does for me anyway.
Absolutely. And just to, like, one, I know we talked about this in the episode together, but just one last plug for why being a guest on another person's podcast is so helpful. I just got an email today from a client that I already have a sense is going to be a really good fit. And they didn't find me through my Instagram or through my podcast. They found me through another podcast and that I was a guest on, talking about postpartum rage. And, you know, and so it was the Herself podcast. And so it's just another confirmation that being a guest on someone else's podcast, I mean, they listened to it recently. I did this episode like weeks ago. So it's this beautiful evergreen marketing tool for your practice or your business or your other offerings. And one thing that the person actually said in this email was, something about your voice and the way you talked about these issues made me realize that I could get help around this, you know? And so I just think what's beautiful with a podcast is, you get to hear the voice and the way they speak about things and what it might be like to be in conversation with this person, which can really begin to demystify the experience of having a conversation with a therapist about some of the things that you're struggling with. And so just a confirmation that these things work. And I have a lot of ways that I market my business, but that's how this really good fit potential client found me today.
I love that. So thank you for sharing that. And you heard it here, folks. She has 2 podcasts of her very own. She does lots of really unique outreach or marketing for her practice. And yet here, this one, not even so recent appearance that she did had this incredible impact and actually moved someone to reach out. That is an awesome story, and it's not a one-off story. There's lots of examples of this that you hear about that are just really exciting. And again, I think it reduces the pressure. Like, you never know what each one of these conversations can yield and what it can do for people. I love that. So is everyone hyped? Is everyone going to just get out there once we log off here and just start putting yourselves out there? I hope you do. That's my not so secret agenda with these.
Go listen to our episodes so that you feel more prepared to go
Yes.
pitch to be a guest on somebody else's podcast, and go and find the podcast that might actually have good listeners. Ooh, listeners, all listeners are good. Listeners, good fits for you, right?
Yes.
And then go record for 45 minutes. And then you have this beautiful evergreen marketing tool that you get to reshare with your audience, and they get to keep sharing with their audience. It's just such a beautiful way to, like you would say, co-create and create this beautiful evergreen marketing tool. So
it's kind of magical. It really is. Thank you so much for being here, friend. This is like the cherry on top of an already really fun live. And
it's like so spontaneous. Like,
I love it. You're like, hey, just rolled in from doing my mom thing. Now I'm gonna chat here.
Going live, I'm like, okay, I guess I'm gonna make sure I'm all buttoned up because I literally was just pumping. But yeah.
It's real life here. Come as you are, right? So everyone, I've already said all of this, but just to recap, if you're just joining us, this will be saved to IGTV, and I'll link up everything, including all of Dr. Cassidy's everything. She is reopening the doors to her fabulous course. I'm happy to answer any questions. As a student in the course myself, I'm happy to answer your questions. And yeah, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.